1 verse 10. It says, "When thou goest forth to war against thine enemies, and the Lord thy God has delivered them into thine hands, and thou hast taken them captive." This is straightforward. War throughout history is common. Even today, war still happens. But as God's people, he fought for them when they were obedient, and they won. This presents the scenario of what to do with those defeated. Notice they are enemies of Israel. These are people against God's law. So where God's law protected women in this particular scenario, enemies would follow weaker laws. Then rape was common during war. The irony is Israel's enemies would think Israel were weak for not doing more, like they would if victorious. So imagine two sets of parents. Parents A discipline, parents B do not. If A's children stayed with parents B, when they were not disciplined, they will feel like parents B are less strict. That's how Israel's enemies would feel with today's passage. Captives were common. Like prisons today, it doesn't make sense for criminals to just roam through. The same applies then. Women were more likely to integrate. This is why options of servitude, marriage, and freedom were more likely for them. Let's move to Deuteronomy 21, verse 11. It says, "And seest among the captives a beautiful woman, and hast a desire unto her, that thou wouldest have her to thy wife." So a man sees a beautiful woman after defeating his enemies and wants to marry her. This is where God's ways are superior to the surrounding laws. Then, you did not need to marry a captive woman. Men would just assault women as they liked after war. Where other men would view women as property, God's people were to view captive women not as property, but as a potential wife. Someone you would provide for, someone you would protect and take care of. And this, for Bible believers, reminds us of Genesis chapter 2. God's original design of relationships between a man and a woman is in view. Marriage, not a fling, not sleeping together without lifelong commitments, but a marriage was the only acceptable relationship in God's eyes. And God always pushed people back to this ideal, regardless of the circumstances. Where men after war would see a woman they like and assault them. Verse 12 is significant. This verse continues to separate God's people from people living by different laws. Deuteronomy 21 verse 12 says, "Then thou shalt bring her home to your house, and she shall shave her head and pare her nails. Take her home, don't assault her like others would, but cut her hair and nails." This may seem weird to us, but this was not a bad thing. This was a good thing for at least two reasons. The previous verse mentioned a beautiful woman. These are steps which would remove or lessen beauty. Men only focused on beauty would not like to do this. This is forcing the man towards a long-term decision, not an impulsive one based on beauty or feeling superior because of victory in war. I want to point out attraction isn't the only reason for rape. Control is another big reason for sexual assault. Notice how other men controlled women by raping them as they pleased. But God made Israelite men not able to do this. These laws take away control from the men. Also, this was common for mourning. Kind of like how people dress in all black today. Mourning then involved ripping clothes, wearing specific clothes, and cutting hair. What many read and think is bad is God protecting the woman. This gave the woman time to mourn the loss of potential family members like a father, a brother, or a son. I get it, it's easy to read this and think things went a certain way. But when we understand the times and what these things mean, it becomes clear. This gets better as we move to the next verse. Let's now move to Deuteronomy 21, verse 13. It says, "And she shall put the raiment, the clothes of her captivity from off her, and she shall remain in your house, and bewail her father and her mother a full month. And after that, thou shalt go in unto her, and be her husband, and she shall be your wife." So take her home, don't assault her like others did, remove her hair and nails, and now treat her like a human. This verse details more forms of mourning and more. The women were not to stay in captivity clothes, kind of like when people get released from prison. These women were now dressed as normal citizens. This is part of the transition into the Israelite culture. She gets a full month to mourn her family who may have died in the war. And this is the same period Israel mourned for Moses or his brother Aaron when he died. The point being, she gets time to mourn like any other Israelite. Then after a month of mourning, seeing the better culture of Israel, the man could then marry her. Again, the emphasis is on marriage. This long procedure shows a better way than the time. You treat the woman with dignity, and you protect the woman from abuse. A question that comes up sometimes is, would a woman ever want to marry a man in this situation? It's a valid question, but it also assumes every woman would be against Israel, which is not true. Rahab in Joshua chapter 2, for example, is a good example. She married into Israel despite her people dying because she believed in God. This is one example of a non-Israelite doing this, and she was willing to join before the war even took place. Now think about after a war. In these 30 days, the woman would see she was not raped like other women would be by different nations. She would see children were not being sacrificed. She would see a much better lifestyle in general. I'm not saying this always happened, but we must not act as if this would be crazy. Before we look at verse 14, this is a good place to mention again, God always was guiding people back to his ideal in Genesis. Can I say this was always followed? No. Were there men who were sinful and disregarded these laws? Yes. Let people break the laws today. But there were laws for lawbreakers, and kind of highlights why God gave a law in the first place. They needed it. Let's now move to Deuteronomy 21, verse 14. It says, "And it shall be, if you have no delight in her, then you shall let her go wherever she wants, but you shall not sell her at all for money. You shall not make merchandise of her, because you have humbled her." This protects the woman from trafficking. Like I mentioned, sinful people would try to game the system. This stopped men from trying to abuse women. God hates divorce, obviously, but like Jesus said in the New Testament, God allowed divorce for the hardness of men's heart. God would not like this marriage to end, but if it did, the man could not sell his wife. He must let her go wherever she wanted to. She was free. The fact it says you must not sell her and you shouldn't profit from her is important. Repeating this shows importance, and by saying the man had humbled her highlights God's view on. After taking all of these steps to avoid sin like other men would, and then to marry her and divorce her is bad. This word humbled in Hebrew describes the Egyptian treatment of Israel. This also describes Sarah's bad treatment of Hagar in Genesis chapter 16, and describes a warning about Jacob's treatment of his wives in Genesis 31. The point being, God sees this as mistreatment. This is subtle, but highlights God's view after showing us how God's way is different from the other nations. If you would like me to cover some other passages or explain